Growing up, were you exposed to or influenced by a lot of Canadian music?
I was, but certainly not overtly. It was just the fact that my older siblings were into some Canadian music. In particular, my older brother in particular was into Rush. So the first concert I ever got taken to was Rush when I would have been 10.
How do you think that concert affected you greatly for your career?
Well, I think at that point I already wanted to be a musician. You know, I was in about the fourth grade when I started playing guitar and decided that was the only thing I wanted to do with my life. But seeing 3 people make that much music was really exciting.
When did you first become involved with the Toronto music scene?
In about '88, I started playing clubs in Toronto. And I had been a class clown, always getting up at every assembly, in the choir, in the band, at school. So performing for me was already a natural part of what I did. Mm-hmm. But getting up at a nightclub in Toronto was all of a sudden really cool, you know. And the first time we played was at this tiny little club called The Last Temptation in Kensington Market. And it maybe holds 40 people. But I think when you're a performer, it doesn't matter. The size of the room doesn't matter. Like when you have 40 people packed in to a club, it's like, we filled the place, you know? My last show in Toronto, there was 40 people working at the show. So it's amazing, but I always tell people I like playing around a campfire as much as I like playing in an arena. You know, when you're a performer, you just like to perform.
What are the most drastic changes in the Toronto music scene compared to now and then?
Well, it's funny. I would actually say I'm not really a part of the Toronto music scene now. You know, I get out when I can, and I went out and played at a club last night. Kevin in my band had a solo show, so I went and sang a song with him. But Kev actually said on the stage, it's like seeing Sasquatch. The fact that I would be out in a club, like it just doesn't really happen very often, you know. I'm friends with a lot of the musicians that play around Toronto, but I rarely go out to clubs, and I don't really have a finger on the pulse of the Toronto music scene. And even really, I would say, the Canadian music scene. People often ask me for advice, and I say, I don't know the players up here. You know, we were signed directly to a US record deal in '92. All of our dealings with the label have been out of America. And we've had a great relationship with the Canadian industry and with labels up here and with press and stuff. But I've always felt a little bit distant, and sometimes frustratingly so, from the Toronto scene and the Canadian scene.
How did the Americans react when you first started touring and playing in America as a Canadian band?
Well, it's funny because, you know, we were so huge up here in the early 90s, and for the most part, people hadn't heard of us in the US yet. But we got signed based on our, rampant success here in Canada, and the label thought, okay, well, this is going to work in the US. But in terms of the industry, you know, I think most people, especially people who live in New York and live in Michigan and live in these border states, they realize we're not that different. It's a border. There's some ideological differences, but the people are largely similar. But in terms of the industry, radio programmers, record company people, Canada might as well be Portugal. Like, it is this other nation where the rules don't apply. They've heard about CanCon regulations, and they think it means that every Canadian band has been like subsidized to success and that they're not high quality. What they don't know is that Canada is one of the hardest places in the world to tour. So bands that tour up here are awesome. You know, they travel like no other country. They work their asses off, and there's great music fans up here because it's so cold. People need to be entertained, you know? So there's something in the DNA up here that makes good performers. It's made, you know, from Leonard Cohen to Joni Mitchell to Neil Young to, you know, the list goes on and on, BTO, all these bands from 60s, 70s that really shaped rock music as it is today. Now, most of those people moved to California and lived there, but they spent their formative years in this country. And it's funny that there's a disconnect. It's the same in acting and comedy. Like, Canadians are everywhere, you know. But I think there's a big hurdle to get over for Canadian performers in terms of the perception of what success in Canada means to the United States. I think, you know, I guess it's because we're a vast country, but our population is way less than the state of New York, you know. So I think in the beginning, our massive success in Canada meant nothing to the American labels and to the American radio people. They needed to see success in America before they were going to get behind the band.
The Barenaked Ladies were one of the first few to successfully stay in Canada and break through in the American mainstream. But many Canadian musicians don't. And I believe the first Barenaked Ladies American tour was actually unsuccessful. And so why do you think it's so hard for Canadian musicians to get their music heard and achieve success in the States?
It was unsuccessful. It was wildly unsuccessful. Our first couple of years of touring, we used to joke. We would say, why don't we just put suitcases full of money on top of the tour bus and drive down the interstate? Because at least then we might get some press. You know, why do we have to bother going and playing all these shows? And the reason we did it was because we loved to perform, and every time we'd go back to a city, there'd be more people coming out to the show. But we had no help, like no help. There was no one sounding the alarm and saying, you know, go see these guys. It was all word of mouth. And I've had that discussion with a lot of people that have said, oh, well, you know, you guys got lucky. You broke through in the US, and that's really rare. Like, we broke through in the US the same way that anybody makes it big in Canada. The problem is it's 10 times bigger. So we did 10 times more shows, and I think it's really discouraging when you have success in Canada and you're huge and everybody wants a piece of you, and you literally drive over the border, you're 20 minutes from where you're a superstar, and you're playing in a crappy little club and nobody gives a shit. I think a lot of people just turn around and go home because they're like, well, I don't need to deal with that. I'm playing arenas in Canada. I'm getting awards. I'm nominated for Record of the Year, blah, blah, blah. I don't need to go down to America because I'm a superstar here and I don't want to go down and play clubs. Well, the problem is there's a very small pie in Canada. And when you have a big piece, you don't get a piece the next time pie is served. You know, so we toured for about 93 to 98. So 5 years we worked really hard in America for very little reward. And we built things up, and slowly, and then we managed to have a hit single after 5 years of relentless touring. The record company got really behind the band because we were just relentless. We just played everywhere all the time, and everything we were asked to do, we did. Can you go do this morning show? Can you go in at 6 a.m. in Columbus, Ohio? And we'd be like, yes. And we would show up, and we'd be pleasant and polite and fun and good, you know? And we do that everywhere. We toured for 18 months doing 3 shows a day. We'd go do a morning show, an hour on the radio playing songs. Then we'd do an in-store appearance in the afternoon, go play for an hour in a record store, and then we'd do our show that night. Plus we'd do a sound check and invite the radio station to bring listeners in. So it was almost like 4 shows a day. For 18 months we did that. So we just, I mean, there's no secret. We just worked our asses off, and we got really lucky. You know, things fell into place for us, and the record company got so behind the band at one point, when we put out the live record, they, you know, you guys have heard about when a record company works a single. You know, they press a single, they deliver it to radio stations, and they work it. They try to get the radio station to play the single. Well, they did that with our Old Apartment song for over a year. Like, that's unprecedented. Normally a single gets serviced, and if it doesn't happen, if nothing happens, then they move on to the next single. But the local reps, the ones who were responsible for talking to radio, they loved the band. Like, we won them over. Even though the top of the record company kind of didn't know we existed, we were like everybody, the foot soldiers, like we were everybody's favorite. They loved us. So for a year, they kept resurfacing the single. Play this. These guys are coming to town. You got to play this single. And eventually, it was a hit, but it was a hit regionally all at different times. So we had a hit in Michigan, and then with the same song. A month later, we had a hit in Minnesota, and then we'd have a hit in Arizona. Like, it was never like, oh, this is a big national hit. It was regional. And then when we released Stunt after that, it debuted at number 3 on the Billboard charts and sold like 240,000 copies the first week. Because it had all built up so slowly, and then it just exploded.
Were there ever pulls to go to the States to make music, or did you ever feel supported here in Canada?
There was never any reason to. I certainly could have, but my wife and I our family was here, our kids' friends, our friends were all here, and we just made a lifestyle choice really early on. It's like we could go to New York and LA and live a much faster paced life, but we decided to stay here. And as a musician, you know, you go on the road. It doesn't really matter where you live because you're traveling to a different place every night. And then generally when you make a record, you go somewhere to make it. Actually, our last number of records we've just been making here at home as well. But throughout the years, we would go to LA for 2 months and record, or we'd go to Nashville or Austin, Texas. So it didn't really matter where we lived. It's one of those, like, I think if you're in acting, you want to be in New York or LA because you've got to be getting to all those interviews and auditions and casting calls and all that. But as a musician with a band, you know, I don't think it really matters where you're from. If you were a solo musician, like if you're a guitar player and you're not a writer and you want to make it, then maybe you want to be in LA or New York so that you're getting those calls to be in the studio and play on records and hopefully get a gig with a band. But as a touring band, it never really mattered where we lived. Some of the guys lived elsewhere for a while. Jim lived in Vancouver. He lived in Brooklyn for a while. But yeah, it never mattered. Whenever we were working, we were together.
In regards to the industry in Canada and America, what would you say is like the biggest difference between the two?
There are many differences, the easiest thing to point out is just how much bigger the American industry is. It's 10 times bigger. That said, it doesn't operate that differently, you know. As I said before, I think the sensibilities are not that different. I think, you know, the people that I deal with in the LA or New York office of our record company are very similar to the people in the Toronto office at Warner's. You know, they're cool people who love music, and they're part of this giant industry that's trying to figure itself out now. We were lucky because we were at the height of our success at the same time that the record industry was at the height of its success. So we were kind of the industry darlings when the industry was like as good as it had ever been. But we're still around as labels have been closing and downsizing, and ultimately I think music is more popular than ever. More people are listening to more music in more different ways than ever in the history of music, but fewer people can make a living doing it. I think it's always been the case, you know. As you look back, as you keep going back, there have always been huge Canadian artists. Maybe not so identifiably Canadian, you know. As I mentioned before, Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, Leonard Cohen, those are the ones that people haul out every time. But even, you know, go to Avril Lavigne, Sarah McLachlan, Sum 41, Nickelback, you know. I think there have always been Michael Bublé, you know. There have always been big, viable, successful acts from Canada. And I think the more it happens, the more confidence that people have, you know. Drake grew up seeing us and Sarah McLachlan and all of these Canadian artists be top-notch international artists, not these, baby bands relegated to this backwater northern country, you know. For Drake and The Weeknd and the Arcade Fire and all these bands grew up in a world where being Canadian was cool and Canadian artists were international artists. So I think our Canadianness doesn't come with the stigma or disadvantages that maybe it did 20 years ago. I think people are now recognizing that it's pure and simple a country where cool things come from, you know, whether it's music, actors, artists, poets, writers. I think Canada's really made a name for itself.
So just to point out Drake for a second, it's been really crazy as Drake is not only from Toronto and Canadian, but is doing everything that he can to sort of make Canada and Toronto look cool and give the Six this sort of reputation. Cool.
Yeah, I think, you know, and that's just following on whether it was Nelly or all these guys who really kind of repped their city and their region. You know, Drake has made it super cool to be from Canada, and particularly from Toronto. You know, you just said the Six. I'd never heard anyone say the Six until Drake said it, and now it's like, oh yeah, the Six, of course. I guess that's where I'm from now.
Yeah, so like you said, it was us in Canada, or Drake, for example, would always think it would be cool to live in Canada, but now people from all over the world are thinking, oh, now it is cool to live in Canada.
Yeah, and then they come here and go, really? It's really fucking cold here.
Yeah. So partly thanks to Drake, Toronto has gained recognition of having this world-class, on-the-rise music scenes lately. What would you say is your favorite part of the music scene?
Well, it's it's a great city. It's a vibrant city. It's a hugely multicultural city. And it's a city full of industry veterans. You know, those guys, none of those guys came out of nowhere, right? Like the Drakes, the Weekends, all those guys, they got to grow up around industry veterans who've been doing this forever. They worked in studios with engineers that have worked for 25 years, 30 years in the scene. And none of this happens overnight. Drake is an incredibly talented guy who is a product of his environment. You know, nothing happens in a vacuum. And I think it's about pulling back the levels. You know, it's easy to see the connection from The Weeknd to Drake, right? But then you start pulling back those connections and look at the team around Drake and think about who they worked with and where this is all coming from. You know, when I say I'm not that connected to the scene, it's like I still know everybody in it, though. I know who's working on the records. I know who's engineering them. I know who's involved. And that's a cool feeling. You know, we work at the same studio that Drake works at. So I know all those engineers. I know all those people. So, yeah, it's a scene that's exploding, but at the same time, it's pretty grounded, you know, and it's a supportive scene still, I think, and that's something I didn't really see in my travels. I feel it today in the same way that I felt it in the early 90s when we were playing, late 80s, early 90s, when we were playing clubs with the Rheostatics and the Skydiggers and all these other bands at the time. Everybody was like, it wasn't a competition. Everybody was like super supportive of each other and encouraging people to go out to other bands' gigs and playing with each other, and all that cross-pollination was good for everybody, and it was good for the scene. And I think that's what you're seeing now. You know, whether it's Chili Gonzalez playing with Drake, like Jason Chili Gonzalez opened a BNL tour in '95 with his band Sun, and now he's like a big hip-hop producer. You know, Chin and Jetty, his band was called Bass is Bass. They opened for BNL in '94. Now he's like producing Eminem tracks. You know, like all of these guys came from similar places. So everybody's branched out and they're involved in all sorts of things now, but it's like, at the end of the day, it's music.
What would Toronto have to do to further expand their music scene?
Well, I think Toronto's made a lot of steps already. The North by Northeast festivals is a good thing. I think more of a festival culture would really help the city. You know, the thing is, crossing a border isn't easy, right? And that's the barrier that a lot of bands face. Legality issues, someone's got a record, it's a little harder to cross the border. So when you have this massive country with 380 million people in it and festivals all over it, and you can go tour and play anywhere in that country and you can make a great living, why would you bother with the hassle of going over a border to play somewhere where, you know, people are just going to drive from Michigan and upstate New York to go see you anyway? You know, I look at friends of mine like Dave Matthews Band. It's always kind of a pain in the ass for them to come up and play in Toronto. They do it because they know they got a ton of fans up here. I think there's things we could do, not just as a city, but you know, in terms of getting bands across the border that would make these large festival gigs more viable. I think that festival culture is good for music. The Coachellas, the Bonnaroos. It would be great to have something like that in Toronto. And there's a couple of festivals that are springing up that are doing really well. I'd like to see something on the scale of a Coachella at the Downsview site, or even at Echo Park. You know, there's a lot of land down there that they could be making use of. I think that festival atmosphere would really help the city, and I think there's a lot sort of brewing now that could hopefully grow to that sort of status. We've already got a pretty happening club scene. There's lots of great rooms to play. The gear is good. The vibe is good. I think, I think the success we've seen already is due to the confidence of the people here. I think, nobody should try to be more like an American band or try to be anything that they aren't. I think the runaway successes you see from Canadian artists are all because they're unique. And I don't think we should strive to be anything we aren't. I think we should just strive to be better at the things we're good at, and that'll grow the whole thing.
A lot of people believe this is a really exciting time for Canada, as we're doing so well musically in the charts, and we've got this new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau.
I heard that.
Yeah. And the Liberals want to do a lot to further expand Canadian culture. One of the first things that they want to do is they want to give more money to the CBC annually, as Stephen Harper had made a lot of cuts. How important is the CBC to Canadian music?
The thing is, the CBC is not just vital to Canadian music, it's vital to Canadian culture. It's vital to Canadian identity. In 1992, we got a letter from the community of, what's the name of the city? It's an Inuit community on Baffin Island, and they said, would you come up and play at our community center so that we can raise funds to build our own transmitter receiver, so we can have a local show and receive the CBC broadcast up here. And we were like, yes, yeah, we'll come. So we came. The city, I think the whole population of the city was just over 1,000 at the time, and we had 800 plus people at our show. Sold out in advance from infants to grandmothers at the show. And that connection was so vital to those people. And it's a non-commercial identity that connects the nation. It's a coast-to-coast pulse on the country. And the U.S. has it in several ways, whether it's NPR, public access television on a national level. It's just really important. And the CBC is super important to Canadian music, but beyond that, it's important to Canadian culture. And I think a lot of people write it off like, oh, we don't need this thing, because I listen to hit radio. The radio's still going to be there. Why do I need to dump money into the CBC? It is so important. Art is important. Journalism is important. Communication is important. And whether it affects you personally or not, it affects the nation. And, in touring the country, I've been everywhere in this country, and I've seen the vital role that the CBC plays in its identity.
Have you heard of the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Yeah, I have.
So that deal would put at risk Canadian content rules.
Yeah.
So for our final question, why is it so important to keep these Canadian content rules, and why is Canadian music so important?
Well, I think, we live next to a giant, with a giant industry. And there have been periods of time where without the CanCon rules, literally zero Canadian music would get played. And I think the CanCon rules get a bad rap for like, oh, well, you just have to put crappy Canadian songs on the radio. Let's play the 30% crappy music so we can play the 70% awesome music. It's like, it hasn't been that way for 30 years, 40 years. There's so much great music up here. What it's about is it's about forcing people who wouldn't normally have to pay attention to pay attention locally. Because if they just play their American playlists from the conglomerate they're attached to multinationally, then Canadian artists would be totally ignored. Because as I said, as far as the U.S. industry is concerned, we're Portugal up here. We're Spain. Why pay attention? The CanCon rules have helped super amazing Canadian artists get noticed and get on the radio and get in the consciousness. It's not about propping up something that's lesser. It's about supporting something that's awesome. And, even in the early 90s when this CanCon debate was rampant, people were saying, oh, we don't need CanCon anymore. The industry has grown to a point. We've got so many great Canadian artists. Well, all that anybody would do at that point is play the Canadian artists that were successful in the US. And CanCon isn't about just what's popular in the US. It's about bolstering a small industry. Regardless of the success we've had internationally, we're still a small industry here in Canada. And we need to do things to ensure that we grow that industry and support that industry and support those artists. And that's something that CanCon does. And some people lose sight of that, because they look at it like this, unwarranted subsidy program or something. And instead, what it is it's about forcing the industry to support the lifeblood that it exists on. And I think ultimately it's going to get easier and easier and easier and easier, just as it has been getting easier to fulfill your CanCon requirements, because there's so many Canadian artists to play. And because the flip side of that, it's not just about the artists, right? It's only 1/4 of the CanCon requirements is artists. It's the publisher, it's Maple are the 4 parts, right? So it doesn't just bolster the artists, it bolsters the industry as well. So music that's recorded here, music that's written here, it's a lot bigger an issue than it tends to get reduced to. I think it's a really good thing.
Part of the question, you kept mentioning that it was like a good time for you guys. You guys were really lucky, and you kept on mentioning the word lucky. Do you think you guys would have been just as successful now or another time, or like if you guys started earlier or later? Because you kept mentioning that it was a good timing for you guys. Everything was set into place, and I think you guys put in a lot of hard work, but you kept on mentioning luck and how it's good timing. And how would you think like it would have been different if you didn't start at that time?
Yeah, I don't know. It's impossible for me to answer that. But for me, that's more just about recognizing that, yes, we worked our asses off. We've really worked hard. But I know so many other bands, writers, performers that are amazing, that worked hard and never saw a tenth of the success that we saw. So coupled with, first you have to be good. You have to write great songs. You have to be a great performer. You have to have the support of, your band, your families, your record label. And still, it might not happen for you. And that's more often the case. So for me, that's just about recognizing the fact that as hard as we worked, it still took an enormous amount of luck and timing, things that were out of our control, totally out of our control, that clicked into place at just the right points in our career to cause things to grow and grow and grow. But it's a reality that you can be super talented and work harder or as hard as anybody else and still have nothing happen. It's an industry that relies on these alchemical, untraceable moments. So would we be super successful if we came out now? I don't know. When our band started, there wasn't really an internet the way we know it today. There was no YouTube. There was no social media. Imagine that. We built a brand and a career in a totally different world than we live in now, and we've tried to shift and grow into that world, but it's a totally different landscape now.
So like you said, with the internet and stuff, and with the internet and YouTube and streaming, there's so many more different ways for people to listen to music and essentially listen to Canadian music, as even Canadian artists who maybe don't get airtime or stuff, they can spread their music anywhere that they want. So you can definitely utilize that a lot differently.
But it's a double-edged sword too, right? Because you have all this access to your fans, and fans have access to all this music, but that generates a lot of noise, so but that's a good thing. It means that you can discover a band on your own. You haven't been told by a record label or a radio station or anybody else to listen to this. You can seek out a band, you can engage in their music, you can engage in their career, you can fund their records through Kickstarter projects. You can attend virtual concerts with them. All of that is super exciting. It's come with the challenge for all of these bands of rising above the background noise, because now it's not just what radio station am I going to listen to. It's which of the 700,000 options I have at my fingertips, which one is going to get my attention right now. I think it's a great time to be a fan of music because it's all there for you. If you like an artist, you can just go listen to their catalog immediately. If I liked an artist when I was a kid, I had to go down to Yonge Street to Sam the Record Man. I had to ask them to order me their albums. Some of them were not in print anymore, or I'd have to order them as imports from Europe because they didn't make them in North America anymore. Now, if I like someone, I just download their whole catalog and check it out. It's an amazing, exciting time.
So I don't think people would understand when you said that your American tours were basically word of mouth, right? Like there wasn't Twitter, you couldn't tweet.
Yeah.
People weren't watching your YouTube videos. It was word of mouth.
When we went and played in a club in Chicago for the first time, the people who attended our show were the people who just happened to be there that night. Mm-hmm. Or people that had, Torontonians that were there on business and found out we were playing in town because they happened to see it in the local newspaper. Like there was no way to get the word out in the way that you can today, right? So it was, the first time we'd play in a club, there'd be 40 people there. And it's a combination of people who were going to the club anyway that night, and maybe some people that friends tipped them off that we were there or whatever. But all of those people had a great time that night. And so they said, I'm going to watch for you guys. And when you come back in town, I'm going to come again, and I'm going to bring 2 or 3 of my friends. And it grew like that. Yeah, there was no Facebook. There was no YouTube. There was no Twitter. It was literally a groundswell. It was a difficult time to build a fan base, but that fan base you built was so loyal because they had discovered it for themselves.
Okay, thank you so much.
Cheers.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice talking to you.